So we're going to chat about school-based solutions for children who have dyslexia, and we're going to chat about why they are usually better than outside-based assessments. And I guess the background to this is that where I live and where most of you who are doing this course in the sort of countries you live, the standard practice is when a child has dyslexia, or when people think in the school the child has dyslexia, the first thing we want to do is we want to outsource that child to someone else to get some sort of assessment done, because that's the mindset, and that mindset comes from our culture. It doesn't come from effective teaching practice. Okay, it's just something that happened, and we find ourselves in it, and so we find ourselves doing these things that they don't make a lot of sense. Now, I understand that we deal with that culture, but we don't have to be part of it. And we can be something about making some changes, because the best place for that child to get help is actually right there in your classroom. You want that child helped in your school, not just outsourced to someone else. So what goes wrong with the assessment process when you outsource kids? Why would I be saying to you, I think you can help most of these kids within your own school? Well, the first thing to keep in mind is that most psychologists, or most educational psychologists, or whoever you're sending these children to outside of the school, most of them are going to place much more emphasis on making an accurate diagnosis than they're going to place on coming up with solutions so kids can learn. So they're all about a diagnosis, whereas what your child actually needs is a solution. And that's part of why I think they're better off having a teacher who's done this course, who's helping them. So most dyslexia testing is not for the purposes of diagnosing dyslexia and finding solutions. Instead, most testing is about making a conclusion about whether or not a child has phonological dyslexia, and then justifying that conclusion with a 10-page report. And that 10-page report really doesn't help people know what to do next. Now, I've read hundreds of psychologist reports in the last couple of years, and if I'm actually honest about it, most of the time, the only valuable parts in that whole report is the final 2 pages that might contain some suggestions for how to slightly modify learning. The other pages of the report just seem to be copied and pasted with maybe some data, maybe some test results, some numbers, some fancy terminology, but it's always in the last 2 pages of those reports that you'll actually find useful information about some possible steps towards solutions for the child. Now, that to me does not seem like an effective way of dealing with kids, and I just think that there's got to be a better way within our schools. Something else to keep in mind is that a lot of the testing processes for diagnosing children with dyslexia, a lot of the testing processes are based on pen and paper tests. Now, obviously, if a child is really struggling in school to the point where you're sending them away to someone else to get some help, obviously they're not going to do well on pen and paper tests, because those tests just reinforce to the child that they're a failure. So my question is, well, what did you expect, psychologists, when you gave the children pen and paper tests? So many of these children, they go through a whole heap of testing, and then they get a diagnosis of, you have dyslexia. And then they just drop their standards and they give up on their goals, and everyone around them seems to suddenly drop their standards and their expectations of that child, and it's expected, oh, well, that child's just going to struggle for the rest of their life. And so that label on the child now defines their future. Now, that label should not define their future. That label should define what help we're going to give them, not their future. Now, something else to keep in mind is that most psychologists, or educational psychologists, whoever you're sending your children to, most of them are only looking for phonological dyslexia, and they're not looking for visual stress. And you'll hear more about that distinguishing between those two later on in this course. But the bottom line is that most psychologists are only looking for phonological dyslexia. So misdiagnosis is everywhere. And in my career, I've seen about half of the diagnosis reports for children who've been diagnosed as having dyslexia. Half of those reports are actually inaccurate. And that's because the people doing those tests are only looking for phonological dyslexia. They were not looking for visual stress, also known as Irlen syndrome or scotopic sensitivity. So it doesn't make sense to send children for an assessment of phonological dyslexia without making sure that the real issue isn't visual stress. And there'll be more on that later in the course. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that most testing misses the point. The point of this testing should be, tell me the next steps for helping this child. And that's different, because most of the testing we're doing is about, give me a diagnosis of what this child has. Now, if the point of the testing was, tell me what the next steps are, I would be such an advocate for all the outside testing in the world. It's just that that's not what happens. So really, what we want to do, and what I want you to get out of this course, is what are the next steps when a child has phonological dyslexia or something else? What are the next steps? What can we put in place? How can we cause this child to succeed rather than just give them a label? Now, I believe that you or any other educator can deal perfectly well with dyslexia in your own classroom with the knowledge you're going to get from this course. So by the end of this course, you'll know what specific activities and what specific actions will make a big difference for children who have dyslexia. You might have spent 4 years at university learning how to cause people to learn, and that's good. And you've probably also got years of experience in the classroom or in some other way of educating people. And what you're going to do is you're going to take the skills you've already got and you're going to apply them to children who have dyslexia. And we're going to take the mystery out of it and replace the mystery with step-by-step strategies. And that's exactly what educators like you are already good at. So you can do this, and you can do this in your own classroom. And I think you're going to find that this is much more straightforward than you think. And the result is going to be that instead of having to send all our children who are having trouble away to someone else or some expert or someone out there, instead of doing that, you're going to be dealing with them well in your own classroom and making changes that make a big difference for those children.